I got my buddy Mark Williams from Swine Life BBQ here with me, hanging out at the Smokehouse. And Mark, we're gonna pretty much give them everything we know about how to cook some good ribs, right?
That's right. We've cooked a lot of ribs in our day, and we want to show you all the ins and outs, the mistakes we made, and kind of go over everything that we've learned over the past few years.
So you're gonna be able to take what you learned today, make it your own recipe, and you'll be turning out some mighty fine eating ribs. Let's get to cooking, y'all. So what are some of the things that you need to do first when you want to cook some ribs?
Before you ever light that fire, figure out the rib you're going to cook and what you're cooking it on.
For me, eating ribs, I usually think about spare ribs. I'm talking good old down-home eating rib.
I like a loin back rib. If you're going to tell me I'm cooking ribs at home, I'm leaning toward that loin back.
When you want to buy some ribs, what are you looking for when you're looking in the meat counter?
On a loin back rib, I don't want that big, heavy monster rib because a lot of that is loin left on that rib it's going to have a texture issue. You know, it'll dry out on you. It's not going to be as good of pleasant a bite. So on a loin back, I kind of want a thinner loin back. But on a St. Louis spare, a whole spare, I want a thicker rib because you're getting belly then. You're getting that bacon attached to it. So that makes it even better.
When you're picking up those packs, you want a tight seal on the rib. I don't want it to have any kind of compromise to where oxygen's got in there, the pack's all loose. I want them to be, pretty tight, straight bones, and look at the date on them. You don't want to buy something that's old when you're talking pork.
If I know I'm cooking more than one slab, I want to try to get slabs of ribs that are closest to the same weight, regardless if they're heavy or light. That way they all cook even. You don't want a 5-pound rib and a 2-pound rib on the same pit, because then one's going to get done way sooner. You
got to take that into account.
Right.
The size of them in relation to how many slabs of ribs you're cooking. And that bigger rib, it's going to take longer to cook it. That's just, you got to know that going in.
Well, plus you don't want to overload your pit. If you're cooking on a little Weber kettle, you don't want these huge ribs in there that's taking up so much airspace to where you don't have good airflow. They're not going to cook even. So you got to kind of plan that into it again before you ever light that fire.
Now you got your ribs home. What are we going to do to these ribs to get them ready to cook? Bust the ribs out of the packaging they're in, take some paper towel, get any excess moisture off of them. There's always some moisture in the pack. That's just meat juices coming out. Once we get them cleaned up, we're going to take the membrane off the backside. Is that always for you sometimes?
That's an always for me.
Me too.
It's too simple. Just take a dry paper towel and pinch between the bones and you'll grab that membrane, walk your fingers underneath it and just pull it off.
About halfway down the rack?
About halfway down the rack. A loin back rib is much easier to pull the membrane on than a spare rib.
That's right.
So that's one reason sometimes people see us do that. It's like, oh, it's never that easy. Well, loin back is, but the spare ribs are a little bit more difficult getting off. And you can leave the membrane on there. I mean, if you want to chew on something, it's got a little bit of something to chew on.
I look at it as a barrier. It stops your seasoning from getting right up against the meat, and you got to chew on that old tough membrane. So that's why I take them off. How much trimming are you doing to baby back ribs versus what you would do to, say, a set of whole spares or St. Louis cut ribs?
So baby back, I'm always going to look at the thickness. I want to take off any of that additional loin. Now I'll leave some of the dark meat, and you'll see what I'm talking about on these ribs. It's like you'll have a light meat and you'll have a really, really bright red, dark, pretty piece of loin that's on top. And that's kind of the spinalis off the loin is what I would call it, because that loin back rib is right there against it. So that's a pretty good bite, but you'll see a lot of lighter meat on top that I would shave down. Try to get it uniform thickness. That's the biggest thing. If you leave too much of that loin on there, once that rib gets tender, that piece of that loin is going to want to separate from that rib because it's technically not the rib, it's the loin.
What about excess fat? Are you trying to take the time and cut out some of that fat, get it off the top of that rib?
I want to leave some fat in there because I know it's kind of like we discussed on the brisket video, is like a 1/4 inch of fat you can render. Well, you'll figure out in the rib cook that a certain amount of that fat you're going to render out, but some of it you're not. And fat does not bark. White fat will not bark up. It's steadily going to be white fat all the way to the end of the cook. So think about that when you want to, get that bark through and through, end to end on that rib. I want to expose as much meat as I can to build that bark, but I want just enough fat there where you got fat to render and add to it.
Now, are you worried about shiners? I know everybody's heard of shiners on ribs. That's where when you cook them down, you render that fat, you get that bone exposed and you can see it. Does that concern you?
Not at all. We won last weekend and all 3 slabs we had in finals had shiners. So I'm not even worried.
Just covered them up
Just
with
cover
sauce.
them up, touch them up at the end. If you're going for that picture perfect rib, a little bit of rub, you'll never see them shiners.
what are we thinking about when we get ready to season the rib? Now that's the part that to me is really subjective.
Yes.
You could go any kind of way you want it with it.
Cook the rib you want to cook. We've done sausage seasoning. I've done a steakhouse. You know, just salt, a little bit of garlic, and actually treated it just like a prime rib.
If I'm cooking ribs, I'm gonna cook a dry rib. I'm probably not gonna run a binder on it. I'm just gonna season it with whatever barbecue rub I want it to have, and that's gonna be the profile throughout that rib. But if I'm cooking a wet rib or a sauced rib, that's when I'm going to probably use a binder, put me some seasoning on it. I like starting with the salt and pepper base. I use my AP seasoning, and we come back with some barbecue rub and find one that matches your base layer. That's the big thing when you're using multiple rubs, make sure they jive together.
Right.
You don't want to put two things on that are going to clash. You always want to season all sides of the ribs, and that's why I take the membrane off so I can get seasoning on that backside, on those bones. Then I'm going to lay a nice even coat on the meat side, and I'm also going to make sure I get the edges. I want to tap those on the board, get some of that excess seasoning on them because I like the way it cooks. I think it looks better.
So what's your thoughts on seasoning the rib and letting it sit?
See, I usually go about an hour. I like for them to sweat before I put them on the pit. I'm not one of these guys that likes to season them the night before and stick them in the refrigerator or let them set multiple hours, because you got to think the seasonings that we're using have a lot of salt in them, have a lot of sugar in them. And what that does is it starts what I call the cooking process when you start putting seasoning on the meat, because it's pulling moisture out. And as those salts and those sugars pull moisture out, some of the flavor gets pulled inside the meat. Well, that can also cure them. If you go heavy with salts and sugar, it's going to cure that meat, and what that means is it's going to change the texture of it. Yeah, it's going to give you a pretty smoke ring because the meat's turning pink from that reaction.
You're making bacon.
That's right, that's right. And you know, it's ham in the ribs. So if you've ever ate ribs that have like a hammy texture, or that smoke ring runs through to through, tip to tip in the meat, it's probably had a lot of sugar and salt on it. It's set a long time. That's what's curing that rib. So you got to take that into account. And that's why I would go just about an hour is perfect, which is usually about the amount of time it takes for you to get your pit up to temperature. And if you give it that time to do it, it builds a really great bark. And that's what I like, letting it sweat in so I'm forming my bark when it gets on the heat. So I use a binder, like I said, when I'm making wet ribs. Mark, what is your take on when you should use a binder for ribs, or do you have to use a binder?
So I very seldom ever use a binder.
Even in comps?
Even in comps. I'd never use them in comps. If you want to go for a wetter rib, or if you want to build some, like really build some bark, a binder will help for that. Because I mean, you don't have to use mustard. You can use mustard, mayonnaise, ketchup, hot sauce, sriracha. You can use any flavor profile if you want. So if you say you're wanting to build a hotter rib, man, throw some hot sauce on there and use it as a binder. It's one of my favorite eating ribs is a sausage seasoning rib. I'm gonna use a binder because those dry herbs don't want to stick as well. So if you have a coarser rub, a binder does have a good place to hold that in. So I might use a little bit of Wickers or a little bit of, apple cider vinegar or something that's gonna complement the end product.
Are you getting very much flavor, say when you're using mustard or oil or even vinegar? Is it really coming through to where you would know?
I don't think so. Like mustard and stuff like that, no. But if you put a hot sauce on it, yes, because you're putting cayenne pepper on it. You got to think the dry spices that are in that liquid that you're using, they're going to stay, but the liquid portion is not.
You have to let those ribs sweat in if you've used a binder, because often
not as long.
Yeah, it doesn't take as long.
No, because that whatever liquid's in that binder is going to go ahead and start dissolving those seasonings as soon as it hits. So you may, if you're in a hurry, hey man, the party's at 5, we got to get this stuff done. You could use a binder and speed that process up and be on the pit in 15 minutes versus an hour.
I've cooked ribs, and so have you, on all kinds of different pits. So you can cook them on just about anything.
So I think a lot of it is, A, what are you comfortable cooking on? What do you have to cook on?
The biggest thing for me you touched on is what pit you have is the fire management of that pit.
Yeah.
You got to know how to run it. So if you can control the fire, which in hand is going to control the temperature of that grill, you can cook. Now there's all kinds of methods that we've all seen. 3-2-1 is probably one of the ones that everybody's heard of. I don't really cook 3-2-1 anymore. That was an old style of cooking. And what that means is 3 hours in the smoke, 2 hours in the wrap, and then 1 hour to glaze them. That's a long process. And it works. It makes a super tender rib. You're cooking them slow. The big thing with that technique is you're cooking at 225.
Or it might be under.
Even a little lower than that. And you can do the 3-2-1. But most of the time, or I've found that ribs are best in that 250, 275 range. Over years of cooking ribs, that's where I have cooked the absolute best tender, the time it takes to cook them, everything falls into place at cooking between 250 and 275.
I agree. I think a low and slow rib, it's almost kind of like we go back to when we talk about cooking chicken. It's a smaller cut. You don't want it in that heat for that long a period of time, I don't think. So we're cooking 275. You know, I might bump up to 300 depending on the rib itself. We're only going 2 to 2.5 hours in the smoke before we wrap, if we wrap. And then you're only talking about an hour 30 tops in the wrap. So you're, what, a 3.5 hour rib at that point, you know? That's the biggest thing, is just figuring out what your pit likes too. Your pit may not want to run 275.
Like a drum, for instance, they love to run 275.
Yeah, 275, 300.
300, so they're a little hotter. You just have to take those into account. Like when you're cooking on a pellet grill, you can drop that temperature down at first to get some more smoke on it, and then raise that temperature up real easy by just dialing it up.
This goes back to learning your pit, fire management, and just taking your time and have fun with it. Your first slab of ribs isn't going to be as good as your second, and the more you cook, the better they're going to get. So don't get discouraged on that first slab if they don't turn out perfect, because most likely they're not. You know, it's going to take a learning curve.
I mean, I can remember when I started cooking ribs, we bought one of those $100 grills with the little side firebox. We just put some charcoal in it, threw some wood on it. They were horrible. I mean, we didn't really know what we were doing. There wasn't videos to watch back then. You know, you had some recipes to go buy from some cookbooks, but the internet wasn't a big thing where people were sharing how to cook, you know, how to cook barbecue especially. I mean, I just remember loading that grill up with as many racks of ribs as we could get on it and fighting that fire. And after 8 hours, we still weren't even close to being done. We had bad smoke rolling the whole time. And I don't even know if they were edible. I'm sure somebody ate them at the end of the night, and it was probably closer to midnight, several gold tops later. Yeah. And I look at where I've came from that and understanding the process and what it takes to really cook some good ribs. That's what the years of experience and practice and doing it, learning those pits and how to cook them on different pits, that all comes into play there. But you got to start somewhere.
You got to
That's
start
the main
somewhere.
thing. Don't be scared to jump in there and try to cook ribs.
My first time of cooking ribs, it was like eating a campfire with bones in it. I mean, it was, put smoke to it, you know.
So how do you get that clean fire? And depending on whatever grill you're working on, what makes a good clean fire that you can burn wood on and get some smoke for flavor?
If a pellet grill will run itself, you know, you're not going to worry about too much on it.
Easy as it can be.
Anything else, it's all about airflow. Everybody has their rhyme or reason they do things. Mine is, if you're running a pit that has an intake and an exhaust, I'm gonna run the intake restricted and I'm gonna run the exhaust more open because I want the exhaust to control the temperature. So just right now in our stick burner, that intake on this pit out here is quarter of the way open. I'm doing all my temperature control with the exhaust. I'll never touch the intake again. And that does two things, is it lets you control it much easier. You're not trying to move two dampers at once, because you start chasing that ghost, you'll never get it to set in where it needs to be. I always want my exhaust to be a little more open than my intake. That way it has positive airflow and it's constantly letting fresh air in. You got a good enough open, exhaust is going out, and you don't have that stagnant air just staying in that pit.
So you're starting with a bed of charcoal usually, get those BTUs up, then you're adding wood to it, and you want to use good seasoned wood, not super green wood. You want it to burn, but you also want some smoke from it, and keep the wood to a minimum. You don't have to burn a quart of wood every time you're cooking. Think of wood as a flavoring. Think of it as your seasoning. That's how we're getting, that good smoke flavor without the bitterness, without that overpower, without tasting it 2 days later, burping it up.
I would guess 2 hours on ribs is all the smoke you need. Now they may need to stay in the heat a little bit longer to get your bark right, but after 2 hours, those ribs should be 150 to 160, maybe even 170. They're creeping on up in temp, so you're good when it comes to smoke.
So we've got 3 different ribs we're cooking today. I want to try 3 different myself just to compare them, but we're doing a more, what I would call a traditional wet or sauced rib. This is it's basically an old comp rib that a lot of people use. It's gonna have the tiger sauce, the butter, the brown sugar. It's gonna have a sauce at the end. They're gonna be smoked perfect. But we're also doing a dry slab of ribs right beside it. And my dry ribs are really eaten ribs. We don't use the binder on them. We just hit them with the barbecue rub. I like a little spicy, so we throw the hot on there. Then we also did a TX rib, which is kind of a savory rib. And my TX seasoning's based off Texas brisket. If you've never tried it on pork, I highly recommend it, because that rib right there is a true eaten rib. You can eat the whole rack of these things. And that's why we wanted to do those 3 today.
You can spritz, you can mop, you can baste, whatever you want to call it, but what are you actually doing?
For me, it's adding moisture to the top of that rib to help it from getting too dark too early, and it helps with the texture. It helps you not create that jerky-like texture on top. It helps them from drying out, basically.
I usually spritz with water just because I'm not wanting to add really flavor to it, but I'm just trying to keep moisture, keep that bark wet. But I mean, we have before used Italian dressing, we've used spray butter. There's really, it's kind of one of them things is, again, it's up to you. You know, use whatever flavor profile that carries that recipe through.
I mean, there's a lot of times I never even baste them. Just run them. If they're eating ribs, season them, you know, burn them and turn them and let them roll. Let them do their own thing. And that's more, you know, old school meat on a pit. Well, the big thing is stay away from sweet.
Yeah, no sugars.
No sugars in your mop, in your baste, because that's what's going to make it turn really dark and can burn. Whenever you add heat to that sugar, it wants to caramelize. And so you can turn it dark really quick by using something sweet. Like, I mean, even as simple as apple juice. Apple juice can turn it dark. Let's talk about wrapping versus not wrapping.
It always goes back to the recipe.
Yeah.
It's what you're trying to accomplish. A no-wrap rib's going to have that strong smoky flavor. It's going to be a little bit different texture. Than a wrap rib's going to be rich pork, a lot of sweet, a lot of those just really, really deep pork flavors are going to shine. So
you can add the butter to it.
You can add all the butter. You can do whatever. With the wrapping, it's like I said, it's going to change the texture. Can you get that good tender rib and not wrap it?
I think so. You know, it comes down to that cook process of rendering that fat that's in that rib, and that's really what makes it tender. So time on the pit. Is it going to have the same mouthfeel? No, they're not. I mean, I think you could tell. I could tell if a rib's been wrapped versus one that hasn't been wrapped. But you can still get that tear apart. Don't need a knife to cut it. I mean, you can get them fall off the bone. No wrapping them. You keep cooking them long enough. I very rarely wrap ribs at home, just because I like the texture of a no-wrap rib. It's a little, you know, it's a little more integrity to it. I wouldn't say it's tough by any means, but it's a different texture.
What does it do when you wrap a rib? Does it speed it up? Does it slow it down?
To me, wrapping does speed it up because it's concentrating all that moisture, all that heat in there. Now, I will say that just from probing, although you got me into probing ribs, whenever we wrap a rib up in full and we put it back on the pit, it never fails. That temperature goes backwards. And I don't know, I can't explain it.
I want it to.
Yeah. Why? I mean, why do you think it does that?
You got a rib that's 160, 170 degrees, and you're putting room temperature butter on it. You're putting room temperature brown sugar in there. It's just like putting ice on a drink. It's going to
You're
shocking it. It's going to stall it a little bit, and it may not necessarily go down. I would like to see, like on a good day when we're cooking, I want to see that temp drop.
How far?
At least 20 degrees. My train of thought is that you render fat at that 150 to 180, 170 range. That's when all your fat's starting to render and that rib's wanting to turn loose. I want to keep it in that as long as I can to render even more fat. Because if you cook a rib too fast, it'll be tender, but it'll be greasy. You're going to have that greasy fat on top. You're not rendering all the fat in that rib. So I like to see that rib stall a little bit longer just to get a little bit better. Malcolm, we got a third slab out there. You talked about the TX rub on it. How are we wrapping it?
For me, if I'm thinking TX or Texas style, they got to be butcher paper wrapped. But I like wrapping in butcher paper. I think it gives you a great texture. It keeps a lot of that moisture off the meat itself, so it's not really braising in a packet. When you think about, is it right or wrong to wrap with paper versus foil? Hey, it's pretty much whatever you want to do. But if you like more of a Texas style barbecue, that really good bark, you're saving the bark. You're not washing it off by, you know, wrapping it up super tight. Paper's the way to go.
If you want to add liquid to your wrap, you're going to have to use foil. You know, that paper's not going to add you anything right there. But if you're just wanting to have a good eating rib, it doesn't have to be a TX style. You can still do a barbecue rib, wrap it in butcher paper. I like to take it and spray that paper with water before I wrap, makes it pliable, puts a little bit of moisture in there so when you wrap it up and get it back on the pit, it's good to go. You know, you don't have to worry about it. Still shields it, still keeps it out of the heat, still gets, you know, you keep your color.
But you keep that bark you worked
keep
hard
that
to
bark
build.
you worked hard on. But like we were saying, do you have to add anything to a foil rib?
You really don't. I mean, I've wrapped ribs up with nothing in them before. You catch a lot of that rendered fat at that point.
Which is still really good.
It's still really good. Do you have to add the butter, the brown sugar, or some kind of sauce? No, you could just I've just put barbecue sauce in a wrap before. You don't have to add liquid to it because it's going to make it. I would bet if you didn't put anything in that foil, just the ribs, wrapped them up tight, you're still going to end up with almost probably a half a cup of rendered fat in that foil. And that's going to sit there on those ribs. Is it going to make them good? Yeah, it's really good. Yeah. And so you don't have to worry about them drying out.
we've wrapped 2 slabs here. We left one alone. We got one in foil, one in butcher paper. Now, I normally wrap meat down in foil. Butcher paper can be tricky. You can go either way, but what's your thoughts on meat up or meat down and the benefits?
I've always come to the conclusion that when you wrap a rib and you're wanting to get it tender, you flip it over meat down because gravity's working with it at that point. It's not trying to pull those bones away from the meat. I mean, we're trying to, get them up upwards of 200 degrees. And so that's getting them really tender, and it's rendering out the fat in the meat. So what'll happen is the meat will try to separate. And if you've got them flipped over to where those bones are laying on the grate first, the meat can pull off from them, and when you cut them, you can see a clear separation. But when you cook them meat down, those bones are pulled down too, so they're staying closer to it. They have a better chance to adhere to it. And this is just what I've seen from cooking. I mean, I don't know if scientifically if it's right or wrong. We're cooking them half the way flipped over, meat up, and then we're flipping them down when they're wrapped. And then when we flip them back over to glaze them, they stick together really well. So what is a perfectly tender rib?
That's a loaded question, Malcolm. You take a rib and you can bite it, it stays on the bone, but it's still just pillowy soft.
To have the best flavor in a rib, it's got to be perfectly tender.
You got to have that perfect texture.
They go hand in hand, basically.
A rib that's a little tight doesn't have that richness because you hadn't rendered everything yet. So it doesn't have that buttery texture, and it's missing that flavor. It's a mouthfeel thing. And to me, a rib that's way overcooked, it don't taste like nothing. Like it tastes like it feels, like it's just mush. Yeah, like if it's fall off the bone, I'm sorry, but it's not nearly as good as a rib that's cooked perfectly.
I mean, I've heard that all my life, fall off the bone ribs. You see it, restaurants have used it as a sales gimmick. Our ribs fall off the bone.
No.
I don't think they should fall off the bone. That means, to me, you overcooked. What's the trick to get that perfectly tender rib?
You got to cook them a little bit longer. And I mean, it's plain and simple. And that's one reason I always refer back to investing in a good meat probe that you can leave in there, because you can document, okay, I took them to 202 this time. They were tight. I need to take them 204 next time. All right, they're a little better, but they're still tight. All right, 206, we're going to try it next time. Oh, that's what I want. And then you have a good window. Now, is it going to be 206 every time? No. You learn what that feel feels like with that probe. Once you realize the number with the feel, you no longer have to look at the number.
What do you want in a rib? What does your tenderness feel like, your perfect tenderness?
Some thick pudding. I don't know, like.
With me, I've noticed, like, when you first take your probe, and it could be a toothpick, it could be a skewer, you're gonna feel like a little pop almost. That's going through that initial piece of meat. But you shouldn't have to push it very hard to get on further into that meat. It should be soft, almost no effort going into it. That's the feel you're looking for, but you don't just do that in one spot. You need to skip over a bone or two and see what it feels like in the center of the rack. See what it feels like out towards the edge.
You looked at me like I was crazy when you seen me probe a rib the first time, but we've learned so much since then. Because I struggled with tenderness. Like when we first got big into cooking, that's something I struggled with, because I would get a really good one this time, and the next one wouldn't be as good. And I'm like, well, there's got to be a better way. Let's probe it and see what it does. We probe everything else at a contest, so let's probe ribs. And so I always have. When
you can leave the pit closed and watch it on a wired probe, you're more exact, and you're going to get that same result more consistently. They're done at 165. You can eat that. You can eat a slab of ribs at 165.
You can chew on it all day.
It's going to be tough, and it's probably not going to be. There's going to be a lot of fat still left on it. It's not going to be rendered. And that's why we push them up close to 200 degrees or a little bump over. I'm telling you, if you take a rib to 202, you're going to be dead close.
You'll be close.
Is it going to be perfect, the best bite you ever had? There's always a little room for improvement. But that 202 is magic. I think there's a Facebook page out there that says it, where everybody's a member of that community. But that's the one thing I kind of gauge by. And I just know around 200, I'm in the ballpark.
Yeah.
What are we talking about when we talking about it's time to finish the ribs?
Well, you forgot the key thing. Before you finish them ribs, you better rest them.
Yeah. I always, any meat, you got to rest. I got ahead of myself there. I'm sorry.
To me,
you got to rest them before you. When you get them tender, rest is important.
Right, and we always rest. So we got the ribs tender. It's in the foil. We open them up. We check them to make sure. We look at them. They're tender. I'm gonna let that foil vent for just a little bit and let that steam off, so it throws the brakes on them ribs.
How long?
At least 2 minutes. 2
to 5.
Yeah,
right?
2 to 5. Now, if I probe them ribs, I'm like, ooh, I might have went a little too far. I'm gonna vent them a little bit longer, you know. And then also, if they feel good but they're not quite soft, I won't vent them at all. I'll just wrap them up and let them. The carryover cook is a real thing. And
So that's what happens in the rest. They are trying to carry over.
They're trying to carry over. So you want to control your carryover by the venting process. You just need a cheap cooler or something. Or wrap them up in a towel, put them in an oven that's not on. But I at least want to see an hour rest on a rib. Again, it's calming down. Moisture's redistributing through the whole thing. You're absorbing some of that butter and all that goodness you put in that wrap. And this goes for the ribs that we didn't do anything to. You still want that protein to calm down and rest.
So the butcher paper rib you're resting. What about the dry rib? Now, are you going to give those a rest, or are you just going to go ahead and finish them?
So I'm going to rest them. Throw it in a pan, a big foil pan, and put a lid on it, whatever. You just want to kind of let them calm down. Again, you're wanting to slow down the cook process.
Do they need a full hour too?
I don't think you'd have to go a full hour on them because there's no moisture around them.
Well, now after we've rested our ribs, Mark, we can go ahead and talk about finishing them. That's what, you hear it, we use it all the time. We're finishing the ribs, finishing the ribs. What I mean when we talk about finishing ribs is we're going to get them ready to serve. They're going, that's that last stage of the cooking process. They're coming out of the rest. They're going back on the pit. Now we have 3 styles of ribs that we've done today, and we're going to finish those ribs, but what's it going to take to finish? Let's start with the dry rib. What are we doing?
We're going to let them rest, and then we're going to spritz them and make them wet, and then hit them with dry rub at the end.
So you're really not getting them real wet.
No.
It's just adhering that last
You're just
layer
adding, you'll spritz them with the same water we've been spritzing with. You just want the bark to be a little wet, so when you hit it with that finished dry rub, it has something to stick to, and it's going to bark right back up.
And that's a Memphis thing.
That's a Memphis thing, and it is a good rib.
I don't know anywhere else that does dry ribs like Memphis does. And that's, a lot of those Memphis joints, they'll have a mop that they'll hit them with. It's usually vinegar based or something. A little spritz of water works just fine. But you got to have something to tack that surface up and to make that last hit of rub stick, and it makes that perfectly dry, seasoned, dry rub rib. The TX or the Texas style savory rib, we ain't doing nothing to those.
Get it out of the butcher paper.
You take it out of that butcher paper, and what little bit of moisture or renderings have stayed around that paper, it makes it even better. So all you do is really set those on. And I don't even like drying those out.
No.
I like taking those right out of the rest and then putting them on the cutting board and opening up that greasy paper and then digging into those ribs. Finishing really comes into play with a wet rib.
It does.
And we get this from competitions. We finish them all the time. That's what we do. That's what wins you the trophies, knowing how to finish that rib.
So for me, I'm going to get it out of that wrap, get it out of that liquid, and I'm going either on the grate or on a cooling rack or in a separate pan. I'm getting it away from that liquid. And I'm going to do the backside first. I want the backside of my rib to be just as pretty as the top side. So I'm going to put some dry rub down, let it go about 10 minutes, bark up in the pit, sauce the backside, let it set. I'm going to flip that rib over, and I'm going to do the same thing to the top side. Put the rub down, touch it up, make it pretty, good even color, and then come back with your sauce and let it set.
Now, I call it glazing. And no matter if I'm just using barbecue sauce, to me, when I'm glazing or finishing that rib, I'm brushing on a sauce or some kind of glazed product, and it's going on that last 5 to 7 minutes of the cook time, and it's heating and kind of caramelizing it a little bit and letting it tack up. For a wet rib, do you think it's important to return it to the pit and do that process, or could you just take it out of the wrap, sauce it, and run it?
I think it needs to go back on the pit.
I agree. I think
there's a flavor element there.
Yes.
And you still, I wouldn't be scared at that point. If you had some fruit wood, throw a little bit of cherry on that fire and set some smoke on that sauce.
That's the tip I was fixing to give. You beat me to it, Mark, because what happens is that sauce or whatever you put on that rib at the very end to make it wet acts like a sponge. So if you've got a handful of wood chips, and that's a perfect place for wood chips because they're going to go quick when you put them on some hot coals. You're going to get that burst of smoke from them. And if you're using a fruit wood like apple, cherry, peach, those are going to pop. It's that sauce is going to draw that smoke flavor in real intense. You can't leave it in there long.
No.
If you put too much wood, it's going to get bitter on you and have a really bad taste. But just burning those handful of wood chips right there at the end, that's a great little pro tip that a lot of people don't tell you about that'll give you that pop of smoke flavor.
It's good.
Another big thing with the finishing of the ribs, and we get this from comps, Mark, is it's a great time to make up for errors. I don't care if I take the ugliest rib in the world out of the wrap. I mean, if it's cooked perfectly tender, I can dress that dude up and make it the star of the show.
Well, most of the time when they come out of the wrap, They are ugly.
They are, because you've hammered them. You've got them dudes wrapped up in foil, pressured with all that butter and brown sugar and sauce and stuff you put in the wrap. And it's going to wash some of that rub off, and they're not near as pretty as when they went in. But all this talking about ribs, Mark, has got me ready to eat some of these that we've had out there on the pit today.
Let's go get some ribs.
We're starting with that TX butcher paper wrap rib. Oh, look at that! Look at that!
I know you left me some loin too.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to start with. Now let's look at the difference. So you pull that loin off.
Look at that moisture.
Smoke ring, moisture all in it.
That's a rib you sit down, you enjoy. It's not too much of anything. You taste the pork. I ain't had one of these.
Rich.
I ain't had a slab like this in a long time.
The savoriness of it, smoke, salt and pepper, all it is. That's all it is. That's essence of barbecue right there. It's so hard for a saucy rib to beat that, in my opinion.
That's good.
Ain't nothing left to do but try these,
Dive
man.
in.
Let me see if it'll break just like the TX. And look at that. Perfect break, right down the middle.
Still full
Beautiful, beautiful color on them. The Memphis style dry rub rib, or just a dry rib with that barbecue seasoning, you get the barbecue elements of it. It tastes like something you get at a Memphis barbecue joint.
It's amazing how good simple barbecue really is. Like, you don't have to overcomplicate it.
Doesn't get any easier than these two.
All right, last one. You ready?
Oh, look at this.
Now, this one's got
Look
some
at
moisture.
this. We got two bone. You got the two bone test there. Take one right out.
Now, I will say this one definitely has more moisture.
It's got it. We still got some of that loin on top. It's soft. The bark's soft. That's that pillowy bite, but it's not fall off the bone, but it'll jump off the bone. Watch. Well, I tell you. That is 3 ribs, all 3 different, and I ain't mad at none of them. It's all in the process, man. And cooking ribs is not hard. Anybody can do it as long as you have a good game plan going in. Mark, I just want to say thanks, man, for coming out, talking ribs with me today. We appreciate y'all hanging out with us, watching the video. We'll see y'all next time. Go cook some ribs.
Put a fork in it.
Put a fork in it.
She's done.